Lovely. Yeah, thank you again so much for joining us. Everyone attending our events, your support means a lot to us. Several of our attendees today are Holocaust survivors and refugees or their family members as well. And I'd like to give an especially warm welcome to them. My name's Alex. So you've been receiving emails from me, I hope. So that's why you're here. I'm the Visitor Operations Manager at the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre, based at the University of Huddersfield in the north of England. And I'm here more for the tech side than anything else. I'll be monitoring the chat function. If you have any tech issues, please let me know, flag it up in there and I'll do my best to help. And we're also using the chat function for questions. So during the talk, as well as at the end, if you think of a question, then please type it in the chat and we'll make sure that that we have a nice range of questions. So yes, please do get your thinking caps on if there's anything you particularly want to ask Brendan McGeever, our speaker. We are recording this talk, and in the next day or two, I'll send out the link to access the recording and a link to a short online survey as well, because we really want all the feedback we can get on these events. You're already supporting us by attending this event, but if you are able to help us even more and continue to do events like this, you can, if you're able to give as little as £1, we appreciate every penny. You can also follow our work on social media and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do all of this on our website, either by clicking Give and Help in the top right hand corner of our main web page, or at the very bottom of our main homepage. You should be able to see on your screens now where you can sign up to our newsletter, and there's a purple rectangle where you can click to donate as well. Just a little bit about us, really. The Holocaust Exhibition Learning Centre is survivor founded. We exist because of a group of people who were all made new lives in the north of England, whether they'd fled persecution prior to 1939 from Germany or in other areas controlled by the Nazi regime, or whether they survived the Holocaust itself, camps, death marches, some in hiding. They came together in friendship to share their stories and support each other. And that's why the centre exists as well, to continue that work of education with the idea that we never want it to happen again. We also work with commemorating other events, such as the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia, and that happened 25 years ago this year. On your screen now, she says, are the 4 themes that our online events are exploring. So we have transnational Jewish identities at the periphery. We have archives, collections and material memory, sexuality, desire and the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism and perpetratorship. And it's the latter that we're here to explore today. We're aiming with these events to champion eyewitness testimony and little heard voices as well, and exploring links between past and present, the idea of memory, and challenging those misconceptions and stereotypes that still persist. One of the themes covered in our events, it's also visible in the exhibition, which is now open again, with bags of hand sanitizer and safety measures in place. We also have a learning programme with groups of all ages. We embed in our learning and the exhibition the fact that the Holocaust did not begin with murder. It began with words, recycling conspiracy theories and tired stereotypes, and of people seen as other. And anti-Semitism and other prejudices were part of society before the Nazi regime even existed. So exploring this theme is why we're here today with our speaker, Brendan McGeever. Dr. Brendan McGeever is the lecturer in the Sociology of Racialization and Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck in the University of London. He's a research associate at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which is based at Birkbeck. He works on anti-Semitism and other racisms, past and present. And he is the author of a new book, Anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution, which is the winner of the 2020 Reginald Zelnick Book Prize for History, and was also given honourable mention for the W. Bruce Lincoln Prize. And he's also named a 2019 BBC New Generation Thinker. You'll hear more from me at the very end, and helping to field all the hopefully wonderful questions that I'm hoping we'll get lots of great questions for Brendan. But I'll now hand over to him. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. I'm just going to try and get this screen share to work. Bear with me a second. Is it working okay?
Yep, great.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Alex, to you and to Alessandro and to all of your colleagues at the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Centre for inviting me to be with you all tonight to give this talk. Now, it was Alessandro that first wrote to me, actually, quite some months ago now, to ask if I wanted to come to the centre to talk about anti-Semitism. And we bounced a few ideas around together. Should we talk about the past? Should we talk about contemporary events? And well, I don't think either of us for one moment could quite anticipate just how contemporary events would catch up with us. And certainly we did not imagine that our discussion this evening would fall on the same day that the EHRC report into the Labour Party would land. So here we are, gathered in these extraordinary political circumstances against a quite unprecedented political backdrop to discuss the past. We'll see if we manage to stick to the past. But just to say, I'm really genuinely delighted to be here with you all on any day, but especially on this day as we grapple with some difficult issues. I want to talk to you tonight about a book that I've written, which you can see on the screen, hopefully, which is entitled Anti-Semitism and the Russian Revolution. And it's a book that tries to get to grips with a chapter in the history of anti-Semitism and the left. And it's, again, just reflecting for a moment on the fact that we're talking about this today. I started this project, I started learning Russian and exploring this topic pretty much exactly 10 years ago, actually. And I had an unusual situation 10 years ago. I was up in Glasgow at the university there and in a sociology department. And when people asked, what's your PhD on? And I said, anti-Semitism and the left 100 years ago in the Russian Revolution, they sort of said, what's the point of that? Why would that be of interest to anyone today? If you fast forward a decade, here we are now. I have a kind of different problem. But when my friends and family ask me, what are you doing? And I say, more about anti-Semitism and the left, they roll their eyes like I've heard too much of it. So it's a kind of unusual trajectory that this topic has had, kind of out with my control, obviously. But I want to begin not in 2020 in the political storm that's taking place within the Labour Party. Rather, I want to begin in 1919 in Kiev, in a village called Rasava, which is in the Kiev province. It's a Jewish socialist named Ilya Shmulevich, and he's just been arrested by a member of the local Bolshevik government, along with 6 other Jews, for no other crime than their being Jewish. And I want to read you his testimony. And Alex said in her opening remarks that the centre is founded in part to explore eyewitness testimony. And I want to begin with an eyewitness testimony. It's quite long. It'll take a minute or so, but I think it takes us right to the heart of the matter. So this is Shmulevich. He's just been arrested by Bolsheviks. They loaded their revolvers. Sensing the inevitability of my death, I spluttered out, I am a poor worker. I am a Bolshevik. The passion of my trembling voice seemed to soften up the menacing Red Army commander, who agreed to grant us the temporary right to live, subject to approval by the Commissar. Before adding poisonously, I may be your brother, but I don't trust you Jews. There are too many of you among us. The Commissar ordered us to be shot on the spot. One of the condemned, Podolsky, for some reason kept his hands deep within his pockets, refusing to take them out. Thrown into a rage by this refusal to follow orders, the commissar took out his sabre and struck Podolsky several times to the head. The blows were so hard, his skull split open and his brain spilled onto the floor. My death now seemed inevitable. I began frantically restating my commitment to the Bolsheviks, to the working class and to its liberation. To my great fortune, one of the guards shouted out, "Okay, send this Yid to the court instead." As I walked away, I heard the sound of gunshots. My fellow comrades had all fallen. I was taken back to the commissar. He pushed me up against the wall, put the revolver to my head. "Are you a Jew?" he said. I replied, "I am not a Jew. I am a soldier of labor, a soldier of the revolution." "Very well, off you go," he said, and I walked free. At the first checkpoint, I was stopped by a Red Army soldier again. He said, "What's your nationality?" I answered with a phrase now filled with happiness. "I am a soldier of revolution, a soldier of labor." He replied, "I too am an internationalist, but I want to know, are you a Jew or not?" I answered, "For an internationalist, it makes no sense to ask what nationality one belongs to." The soldier, waving his hand as if to get rid of a bad smell, said, "Off you go." That's the end of the testimony. Now, in much of the existing literature on the Russian Revolution, anti-Semitism is framed as counter-revolution, as the preserve of the as the preserve of the anti-Bolshevik political right. And there is good reason for this conception. The Tsarist regime, as many of you will know, was defined by its anti-Semitism. And the Bolshevik leadership, led by Lenin and some significant Jewish individuals, opposed anti-Semitism. But this is not the full story. As this shocking testimony that I just read to you makes clear, on the ground, anti-Semitism traversed the political divide in revolutionary Russia, finding traction across all social classes and all political loyalties. For the Bolsheviks, and for many generations of Marxists ever since, racism and revolution are framed in contestation. Racism over here, revolution over here. However, in the Russian Revolution, anti-Semitism and class politics could be overlapping as well as competing political projects. Now, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, in the October of that year, they announced the overthrow of a world that was tremendously scarred by exploitation, by domination, and other forms of oppression. And that project, that Bolshevik project, was driven first and foremost by a quite unprecedented mobilization of class injuries and class grievances. And the revolution offered deliverance from all of that, and also deliverance from the gendered injustices of a society formed by patriarchy, and also deliverance from the injustices of racialized domination as well. And it was that promise of a world free of racism, in particular, that resonated far and wide and reached a truly global multi-ethnic audience. And that sentiment is captured really powerfully here in the writings of the Jamaican black writer Claude McKay. Now, in 1922, Claude McKay actually traveled to revolutionary Russia to take part in a major gathering of the Communist International. And this is an image of McKay in Moscow that you can see on your screens, in the Kremlin, in fact. Now, you may ask, why am I beginning with Claude McKay? McKay's interest in the Bolshevik project stemmed specifically from the Soviet government's record of combating anti-Semitism. This is what McKay wrote in 1919, and this is his language. He wrote, I can't actually see the quote because some people are, there's lots of nice faces on my screen, so I can't see the quote, but I'll remember the bit from it where McKay says, "Bolshevism has made Russia safe for the Jew, and it might make the United States safe for the Negro." This is McKay's language. "If the Russian idea will take hold of the white masses of the Western world, then black toilers will be free." So McKay's looking to Russia and saying it has liberated Jews, it might liberate us here in the West. And I love this quotation, and I try to fit it into every single talk I give about any topic, actually, because it shows a really interesting moment where black and Jewish voices come together through radical politics. Something that's difficult to happen actually today in 2020 for a whole set of reasons. But just as McKay is putting pen to paper in this 1919 article, the most explosive wave of anti-Jewish violence is actually taking place in the former Pale of Settlement in revolutionary Russia. And what we're talking about here is the most significant assault in Jewish life in pre-Holocaust modern history. Historians that have written on this subject say that at the very least, and these are the most conservative estimates, at the very least 40 to 60,000 Jews were murdered in the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, which took place from 1917 to 1921. But the number was much more likely to have exceeded 100,000, and even Soviet politicians at the time speculated that 200,000 may have perished. We will never know. So here you have the Russian Revolution, this moment of emancipation, liberation, which for many Jews was accompanied by racialized violence on a quite unprecedented scale. And what shocked the Bolshevik leadership, Lenin and Trotsky and others, was the participation of the Red Army in some of this violence. So workers and peasants, mobilized by revolution, had turned onto Jews. And this was the task I sat myself when I started to write this book. Why was it that the project of class justice, social justice, could sometimes take an anti-Semitic turn? Why was it that anti-Semitism proved to be so tremendously explosive for the Bolshevik project? And why could anti-Semitism overlap in some instances, not always, with revolutionary politics? Those were the first sort of set of questions I sat down to tackle. The second set of questions were, well, what did the Bolsheviks do about this? How did they handle this explosive situation where anti-Semitism appeared from within a project designed to emancipate people, not murder them? So I asked the question, well, who responded to anti-Semitism? Who did the work? The anti-racist work, if we can call it that, of responding to this anti-Semitism. Well, I just want to make something clear before I sort of tell you about the answers that I found to those questions. The Red Army was the least prone to anti-Semitic violence of all the military forces that participated in the Russian Revolution. There was a classic study, for example, carried out by the Yiddish scholar Gergel in the very early 1920s. And he calculated that actually, if you look on your screen here, the vast majority of pogroms were carried out by anti-Bolshevik forces. So if you look on your screen at the top, you can see Petlura's army, you can see Denikin's army, 493, 213 pogroms for each of these organizations. If you scroll right to the far right, you'll see that 40% and 17.2% respectively are attributed to anti-Bolshevik forces. Yet also the Red Army is here. It's called the Soviet Army actually. 8.6% of the pogroms. Actually, that figure should be enlarged to around 12% to accommodate Grigoriev's pogroms, which are just above the Soviet Army on the table. Anyway, let's just say 1 in 10 pogroms are carried out by the Red Army to make things straightforward. I place that 10% at the center of my study, not because we can make any claims that this is the most significant anti-Semitic force within the pogroms. Clearly, it is not. I place it center stage because of the profound challenge that the fact of anti-Semitism on the left posed for the Bolshevik project. That is to say, when the Bolsheviks confronted anti-Semitism in the Russian Revolution, they were confronting an anti-Semitism that had found traction within the party's own social base. In fact, the first pogroms that took place after the October Revolution were not White Army or anti-Bolshevik pogroms, but were in fact Red Army pogroms in the Ukrainian northeast, in Chernigov in the spring of 1918. And this was a precursor to what would happen in the spring and summer of 1919, the following year, when the Bolsheviks took hold of Ukraine and the western borderlands once more. So what I did, just to tell you, is I went to Moscow, lived there for a year, I went to Ukraine as well, and spent many, many hours in the archives there, looking through all sorts of documents, trying to get a sense of this. And one of the documents that one of the sets of documents that I looked at were these things called svodki. I don't know if there are any Russian speakers in the room, but svodki are like reports. These are reports written for Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik leadership, detailing what the Red Army is up to. So reports on the ground. For example, we need 23 boots in this regiment. We need 18 hats in this one. Our local regiment has done this, it's done that. And also it reports on the political mood of the regiment, which for me was very interesting. Now I went through these reports, 3 reports every week, 2 to 3 reports every week for the whole of the year 1919, read every single one of them. And what I found in these reports was that anti-Semitism was present within the Red Army in every single province across the whole of Ukraine and the western borderlands in the year 1919. In fact, the situation was so grave that some of these Bolshevik commanders that are writing these reports wrote things like, the situation is so grave in our regiment, we cannot go near our own Red Army soldiers to talk to them about anti-Semitism. Otherwise, they will kill us on the spot for being Yid speculators. I'm going to read from one of these reports. Political work among the Red Army is entirely impossible. Anti-Semitism is so strongly developed, pogroms have become an everyday occurrence. This is from the Soviet First Army, a report from the spring of 1919. And one of the slogans that Red Army soldiers chanted in this period was, "Smash the Jews, long live Soviet power." Smash the Jews, long live Soviet power. So on the ground, the lines of demarcation between revolution and counter-revolution, internationalist and anti-Semite, lines of demarcation that were so clear in the minds of the Bolshevik leadership, were on the ground, in fact, fluid and porous. So as I sat in the archives, I tried to make sense of this. What on earth is going on? Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership are opposed to pogroms, yet on the ground there's this tremendous confluence in certain regions taking place. Well, any explanation for this has to be many-sided. The pogroms are at once a cause of international, national, and local events. And we need a heterogeneous understanding, not a homogeneous one, if we're to understand the complexity of this phenomenon known as the pogrom. But in the book, one of the things I tried to do was to talk about class, actually, and the way that class could overlap with anti-Semitism. What do I mean by this? In Ukraine in particular, the Bolsheviks had a social base, a base for political activism that fought for a populist conception of revolution. So a power of the people, of the laboring people. Against who? Who is the revolution against on the ground? It's against the capitalists, it's against the speculators, and against the exploiters. Perhaps you can see where I'm going with this. These were standard categories of revolutionary Bolshevism. And as far as the Bolshevik leadership were concerned, they were exactly the kind of categories that would pull people away from nationalism towards class struggle. Not ethnicity, it's about class. It's about capitalists, not what nationality you're from. However, things were much more complicated than that. On the ground, in the revolutionary conjuncture in Ukraine, class and ethnicity were overlapping, not just competing categories. That is to say, the very word Ukrainian, the very word Jew, simultaneously bore class and ethnic overdeterminations. So in the popular culture, the Ukrainian was a true and honest toiler, the kind of toiler that had dirt under their fingernails, you might say. The antithesis of the Jew in the popular imaginary, who was an extractor of surplus labor, not a producer of it. So the Ukrainian peasant, unlike the Jew, has an organic relationship to the land, to the class, to the people, to the nation, and to the revolution. In the popular imagination, we might say. So when the Bolsheviks tried to fight anti-Semitism with the categories of class, they come to realize very quickly that class means something different on the ground. Revolutionary discourse, anti-bourgeois sentiment could sometimes manifest through anti-Semitism. So in the early summer of 1919, the Bolsheviks carry out mass mobilization among the peasantry and among the working class, and the Red Army swells with tens of thousands of new recruits. And if these new recruits declare that they will smash the bourgeoisie, they are admitted without any kind of political screening. And this is a tremendously contentious social base on which to build a revolution. So I guess where I ended up in the book was taking the view that anti-Semitism could at times be a current through which some peasants, some workers, and some Red Army soldiers could move between the categories of revolution and counter-revolution. And the popular Bolshevik slogan of Bolshevik power was vulnerable to an anti-Semitic interpretation on the ground. And this is why you had soldiers shouting things like, "Smash the Jews, long live Soviet power." Which takes me to the second and part of this talk. What did the Bolsheviks do about this? How did they handle this explosive situation of anti-Semitism on the left from within? And not just how, but who? Who actually did the work of articulating a response to this emergency? Well, let's go back again to the literature on the Russian Revolution. There's an assertion in the literature that it was Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership that led a rigorous and determined campaign against anti-Semitism. And this assertion is accompanied by an assumption, which is that it was top-down. The campaign came from the central government and down into the local apparatuses of the Bolshevik government. Well, my book turns this on its head and gives a different interpretation. In fact, I argue that in 1918, the first year of the revolution, the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism came from one single institution. This one. This is the Jewish Commissariat, the Jewish Commissariat of the Soviet government. Now, the Soviet government had a range of departments, we might say, that dealt with a range of political questions. So there was a Zhenotdel, a women's department within the Soviet government that some of you may have heard about. Here is the women's department. There was a Muslim commissariat within the Soviet government. So the Jewish commissariat that you can see on your screen now was part of this broader approach to dealing with national and gendered oppression. And what's fascinating, if you look at this photograph, it may not be apparent, is that there was not a single Bolshevik among the first Jewish commissariat in Moscow. In fact, it was composed of left Zionists and other Jewish socialists. And what I found in the archives, and what I argue in the book, is that it was this organization that led the Soviet response to anti-Semitism. In fact, it was the only organization that was developing a political response to this crisis in the spring of 1918. So there was a Soviet response to anti-Semitism, but it was not Bolshevik in origin. So through the month of April 1918, as these Red Army pogroms are happening in the Ukrainian northeast, it's members of the Jewish Commissariat that are writing to the Soviet leadership demanding that something be done. I want to show you two illustrations of this. The first example of this is a figure called Zvi Friedland, a left Zionist who actually was the head of the Moscow Jewish Commissariat. And there's a possibility that one of Zvi Friedland's relatives are in the audience tonight. I'm not sure, I can't see the names that are on the screen, but I was actually sent this wonderful photograph by Friedland's grandson, that very generously gave me some material. And so when I was in the archive, I came across this figure, Friedland, who's absolutely crucial to the Soviet response to anti-Semitism. Here he is writing to Lenin, in fact, on the 19th of April, 1918. He writes, "The Commissariat has received information about the pogroms in Gluchov." These are Red Army pogroms. "The government of the workers must take all measures to stop the pogroms. We invite the Soviet government to take the appropriate measures. It is the task of the Russian socialist government. So note the direction of agency here, from below to the top. Friedland's deputy, Ilya Dabkovsky, the same day, also wrote a letter to Lenin saying, "We ask you once and for all to put an end to this provocation. We ask you, respected comrade, to ensure that the fight against the pogroms is put onto the agenda." Now, these letters and appeals by Friedland and Dabkovsky were met with silence, actually, or inaction for a number of weeks. And it was in response to that inactivity that they set up their own campaign. They organized an institution within the commissariat called the Department for the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, imaginatively called. They wrote pamphlets. They issued a broad educational program within the Red Army. They gave lectures in factories and to reading groups and so on and so forth, and even went to schools as well. So the impetus for what we might call anti-Semitism or anti-racism was emerging not from the central apparatuses, as is normally assumed in the literature, but from the non-Bolshevik Jewish periphery within the Soviet government in 1918. And this story was repeated to a degree in 1919, the following year, although the party leadership had by this point developed a more noticeable response to anti-Semitism. Lenin issued a decree 3 months after Friedland had written to him. It was not until a whole layer of new Jewish socialists moved into the Soviet government, this time Bundists, and members of the United Jewish Socialist Workers' Party. It was not until these activists came in to the Soviet government that a more consistent opposition to anti-Semitism was cultivated. They again set up adult education programs, they ran special lectures within the Red Army, and again set up institutions to deal with this issue. Okay, so what? Some of you might be saying, I don't know. What's the point? What's the significance of any of this? What does it matter? Well, when we disaggregate the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism, we find that it was the work of a small group of Jewish revolutionaries who did something unique. They combined their revolutionary politics with a self-identification as Jews, whether that be a Yiddish-inflected Bundism or a Marxist Zionism. What I mean is they engaged with the revolution as Jews. Now, before the revolution, the Bolsheviks and Lenin in particular had a rather assimilationist view on the Jewish question, as it was known then. Lenin said Jewishness is a barrier to revolution. But after, actually, 1917, there was a complete change in approach. The Bolsheviks realized they didn't have any meaningful presence in the Jewish working class. So they turned to those groups of Jews who had those meaningful connections, Bundists and left Zionists, who tried to bring Jewish masses into the Bolshevik project. And these individuals had a radically different relationship to Jewishness than, say, Trotsky, who was aloof from Jewish culture and Jewish languages, and for whom really Jewishness played no significant role in his own self-identification. On the other hand, these individuals that came into the Bolshevik project did have those affinities with Jewish language and culture. And I argue in the book that these individuals brought with them a different type of politics. They brought an urgency and an ethical imperative to the Bolshevik response to anti-Semitism. They spoke from the subject position as Jews. They engaged with the revolution as Jews and against anti-Semitism as such. Now, lest there be any doubt or confusion, let me just clear one thing up. The Bolsheviks opposed anti-Semitism. They issued statements about it and said it was a bad thing. But the move from standpoint to actuality, the move from opposition to an actual campaign against anti-Semitism, that move was taken by this layer of Jewish radicals who were on the margins of the Bolshevik project, but were at the heart of Jewish revolutionary politics. As my PhD supervisor at the time, Satnam Verdi, said to me, he said, Brendan, these figures you found in the archive, they didn't go around race to get to class. They went through race to get to class. And I can talk a bit more about that. I think it's a very powerful and very important point that my supervisor made, and I took it forward in the book. So who were they? You've already met some of these individuals at the a few moments ago. Here are some of the others. Moishe Rafez, a Bundist, Abraham Chaifetz, and David Lipetz. Each of them received a Jewish education as children, and by their teens were completely immersed in revolutionary Jewish politics. They were born amidst a tremendous rupture in East European Jewish history, the 1881 pogrom wave. And unlike their fathers and mothers and grandparents, they studied not in the yeshiva, but in universities abroad. And by the time they reach young adulthood in 1905, they're in the throes of revolution and anti-Semitic violence. The historian Jonathan Frankel captures this beautifully. I'm just going to read a short quotation. Jonathan Frankel wrote, "They were extremely young in 1905, utterly committed to the cause of revolution and armed Jewish self-defense against pogroms. By 1906, the revolution had absorbed their every waking moment, every ounce of their strength and every hope. But to them, revolution meant not a struggle for social equality and political freedom only, but for a national and Jewish liberation." 10 years later, the Soviet response to anti-Semitism had its moorings in the biographies and Jewish lives that Frankel is talking about. So Jewish socialism then provided a source of Soviet opposition to anti-Semitism in the Russian Revolution. And this is not just a Jewish story, in fact. The route from national liberation to communism was a well-trodden one. I started this talk, you might remember, with Claude McKay, the Jamaican-American poet of the Harlem Renaissance. I want to come back to McKay just to end. McKay wrote in 1920, "Although I am an international socialist, I believe that for subject peoples at least, nationalism is the open door to communism." Well, let's listen to one of these Jewish Commissariat members just 1 year later, Avram Merezhin, who wrote, "It's no secret that we have members who were won over to the party solely because the Soviet government does not carry out pogroms against the Jews. The Jewish question was the door through which they came to us." So for McKay and for Merezhin, Black and Jewish, the door that opened the way to communism and to the politics of the universal was the experience of something profoundly particular, the experience of racist and anti-Semitic violence. So the book then makes the case that anti-racism does not flow automatically from the left and from socialist politics. At least a century ago in the Russian Revolution, it had to be cultivated and renewed continually. And as we sit here a century on, grappling with the damage done to the world by anti-Semitism, by racism, and by class injustice, I wonder if the Russian Revolution may yet, all these years later, perhaps still have something to offer us as we think through the emergency that we find ourselves in today. So that's all I've got to say, I think, for now. Thank you so much for the invitation and for listening, and I'd love to hear any questions that you may have. Thank you. Hello.
Okay then. Thank you so much, Brendan. That was really insightful and really helps to including all those individual stories and their words as well. I think I speak for everyone when I say that that really hit home a lot more.
Should I stop sharing? Sorry, Alex.
Yes, if you can, that would be great.
Right. I just get rid of this then. Yeah. Great.
So, and also,
Hi,
yes, faces. So we've had a couple of questions come through, but yeah, I'm happy to have more. Please, if there's anything that you're wanting to know that Brendan's varied and insightful words make you want to know more about, then please type them in the chat now. We've had a couple of questions. First, a question from Michael, who's also one of our lovely volunteers. Why are the pogroms following the Russian Revolution less openly covered in Jewish history than the post-1905 pogroms and the persecutions of Jews by Ukrainian nationalists during the Nazi era? And he's also wondering, to what extent did the 1905 pogroms lay the ground for what followed?
I think so. Was that Michael? Did you say asked that
Yes.
question? I think that's a terrific question, and something I've grappled with and other scholars are grappling with as well. So if you look at the interwar period and some of the East European Jewish cultural writings, political and historical writings, you get this immediate sense that the pogroms are an epoch-defining event, the Civil War pogroms. What happens, of course, 2.5 decades later is something that's even more unprecedented. And there's no doubt that the Shoah is a tremendous shadow, casts a tremendous shadow over the pogroms, and they fade from view. They fade from I guess mainstream Jewish memory, and also that has consequences for scholarship. For a very long time, the pogroms were not covered extensively, at least in Russian or indeed English language scholarship. Now, there was scholarship at the time. Tremendous amount of work carried out, especially by a figure called Ilya Cherykova, who did exhaustive work. But it's significant that Cherykova's work, which began immediately during the pogroms, is still the most exhaustive account that we have to date. It hasn't yet been surpassed. So I think it's certainly the case that the Shoah stands over and above this particular chapter in the history of anti-Semitism, and quite understandably so. What scholars are doing at the moment, and this is really quite interesting, I'm thinking here of Elissa Bemparad and also Jeffrey Weidlanger in the United States. Their work is showing that actually the Civil War pogroms were something of a rehearsal that prepared the ground for the atrocities that took place in the occupied territories. I mean, what their work is showing, that actually the pogroms of Eastern Europe in the Russian Civil War were the site of the very pogroms that took place 20 years later. That is to say, it was the same neighbors that carried out this violence 2.5 decades later. And I think that is a significant finding and contribution from these scholars that changes not only how we understand the Holocaust in the occupied territories, but of course the revolution and the pogroms themselves.
Okay, I hope that answers Michael's question adequately to his satisfaction. We've had another question from Anushka. Thank you for your question. She says she's interested in your focus on the on-the-ground anti-Semitism from the Red Army, and how did this interact with Jewish soldiers who joined the Red Army to exact revenge on the White Army and Ukrainian troops who were leading the pogroms?
Hi Anushka, and thanks so much for this. I'm really pleased you've asked this question, because it's a total silence in the paper, but you've brought it into view for us. Anushka's absolutely right that there was a tremendous movement of radical, socialist, revolutionary Jews into the Red Army, precisely at the very moment that these Red Army pogroms are taking place, and we have to grapple with that. And one of the ways that, I mean, there were a range of responses to this. So Jews move into the Red Army and meet anti-Semitism head on. What did they do about it? Well, there was a big debate about whether there should be Jewish-only Red Army detachments, or whether Jews should just move into the Red Army and mix with other nationalities and form a kind of internationalist brigade. Well, the Marxist-Zionists, of whom Friedland, I mentioned earlier, was a member, they made a proposal that there should be Jewish-only sections in the Red Army. And what they did, in fact, was to carry out surveys of young 17, 18, 19-year-old revolutionary Jews who had moved into the Red Army. They asked them, what should we do? Should we have Jewish-only units, or should we have Jews mixing with others? And the overwhelming responses in these surveys, and they've been preserved in the archives, is that actually Jews did want to have separate Red Army detachments because of their experience of anti-Semitism, really moving responses in the surveys. Like, every time I join my detachment, they shout at me speculator, they shout anti-Semitic comments at me. I want to be with my own people and fight for the revolution. And the historian Oleg Budnitsky has written about this. I can send some material to anyone who wants to read up on it. I touch on it briefly in my book, and what I discuss about it is it just showed how the Bolsheviks agonized over how to deal with this. You know, Trotsky was involved in this debate. Do we have Jewish-only units? Will that provoke anti-Semitism, or will it tackle it? It might tackle it because it will show that Jews go to the front and fight. They don't just sit in clerical positions in the rear. On the other hand, if we see Jewish-only battalions, it might give credibility to the anti-Semitic trope that the revolution is a Jewish revolution, you know, the Judeo-Bolshevik kind of construct. So there was no way out of the racialized bind that Jews found themselves in the Russian Revolution. Any step taken on this kind of terrain would provoke anti-Semitism. That was the gravity of the situation, and it was the profound nature of the way that anti-Semitism was so enculturated into that political moment that there was really no way out, you might say. So the Bolsheviks agonized over what to do. Eventually, they did form Red Army battalions, and most of them were completely wiped out in the Civil War.
Wow. Yes, thank you for elaborating on that, and thank you, Anushka, for your question. Relating to that, we've had a couple of people who have direct family ancestry and direct family members who had played a role in these events. One person, Carol, thank you for sharing this privately with me. I hope it's all right for me to mention this. She says her grandfather was in, I'm really sorry, I'm going to pronounce this totally wrong, Paleozone, and he left London in 1917 for Russia to protect the rights of the Jews, joining Birkbeck and others, staying there till 1922. And his family knows nothing of what he did there. Do you have any awareness of the place I can't pronounce in the National Soviet Union, or any tips from your research about for his family?
Is the unpronounceable word Poalei and then Sion or Zion?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Paleozone.
Paleozone, yeah.
Thank you.
Paleozone is the Labour Zionist political party, which was a kind of left-wing, Zionist organization in Russia that split during the Russian Revolution into kind of different factions, and the left faction was led by Zvi Friedland, the figure who I mentioned earlier on, and described that photograph that was given to me by his grandson. So Zvi Friedland led the left faction, and they joined the Bolsheviks ultimately, moved towards a kind of collaborative stance with the Red Army and the Soviet government. But just to double check the question, was it Carol? Was it, sorry?
Yes.
Carol, did you say that your family member had left Russia or gone to Russia? Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, he left. Well, he originally came from Poland. He was in England with my grandmother and my aunts and uncles and my mother. But he went, when the revolution broke out, he went back to Russia, right, and stayed there for 5 years, leaving his family destitute. And they were so angry with him, they never bothered to question what he did. He came back, 5 years later, totally bald, and no one knows what he got up to when he was there. I do have an obituary that was written in Die Zeit, the Yiddish Times, in Yiddish, but I've translated it, that mentions this period, but we know nothing else of what he did.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much, Carol, for sharing that with us. There's a really rich Paleozone archive in Moscow, which has been not been digitized. It's been turned into a commercialized microfiche, which means that commercial libraries can purchase it. I think Amsterdam has it, and the Bavarian library State Library in Germany has it as well. So you don't have to go to Moscow, although going anywhere at the moment is obviously completely impossible. But I mean, in the future, you would be able to perhaps potentially order some of that archive, or at least photocopies of it, and have it sent to the UK, or go to Amsterdam or Bavaria yourself, or with someone to help you with that. The archive's mostly in Russian, but a large section of it is in Yiddish, and it has tremendous amount of information on left Zionist revolutionaries and the work that they did at local levels. I mean, I've looked at this archive for regions where I know that pogroms took place, that the Red Army was involved in. But if you know at least where, if you knew which region you would be looking for, it would help. But I mean, it's a huge archive. There will surely be something there.
Well, we think he was in Lomja because we've got a photo of him.
Right.
And what's written on the back, we can only assume it says Womja, 1921. By the way, Brendan, if you recognise me, I was on your anti-Semitism course.
I do recognise you, Carol. It's very nice to see you again.
Right.
I realised halfway through who it was.
Yeah, right. Okay, I might forward you the obituary translated. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to mute you again now. I'm sorry. Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for, and it's nice to have reunions as well. Thank you very much for sharing your grandfather's story, what you know of it, and thank you, Brendan, for your pointers. There's several other people who have, as I say, family connections, and sharing some really interesting and difficult choices that some of them made. So thank you, Martin, for he says thank you for providing some perspective. His pregnant maternal grandmother decided to leave her husband behind in Bolshevik Kiev, Russia in 1920 to give birth to his mother in capitalist Pinsk in Poland in 1921. So there's, and you can, even just reading that, you get the idea of how difficult a choice that must have been for her. And Ellen has said she's wondering, there must have been a lot of Jews amongst the Bolsheviks, and why didn't they take any action, or did they avoid identifying themselves as Jews potentially? She's saying her great uncle from a Jewish family served in several capacities in the Cheka until he was executed during Stalin's purges in 1937. So yeah, if there were Jews amongst the Bolsheviks, was it that they faced an impossible choice, or did they reconcile themselves to what was happening?
Thanks for that, Ellen. Again, extraordinary material coming through here on the chat function. It's a privilege to really read this. So this maybe provides an opportunity just to clarify something that I may have sort of glided over. The Bolsheviks are opposed to anti-Semitism at the level of leadership. There's some discussion about whether Stalin was an anti-Semite in 1917. He certainly became anti-Semitic in the later period. Leaving that to one side, the Bolshevik leadership is a thoroughly kind of anti-racist political force, and we need to understand that. And the complication is what this confluence between anti-Semitism and anti-bourgeois sentiment that happens on the ground, as it were, as I mentioned earlier on. Now, the question then arises, and Ellen has asked it for us, why didn't the leadership do more to deal with this? Well, let's just think about this. When Friedland is writing to Lenin and saying something needs to be done in April 1918, this is on the eve of the Czech Legion revolt, which threatens the very existence of the entire Bolshevik project. The Bolsheviks are besieged. It's a civil war. And if you're Lenin and you're looking at items on the agenda, let's just be blunt about this. What is the most important order of the day? Is it saving a couple of hundred Jews in Chernigov, where there's a disgusting and dreadful pogrom taking place, or is it confronting the Czech revolt? Now, I don't know. If you're Lenin, it probably means you deal with the Czech revolt. If you're Friedland, however, who's engaged with this revolution as a revolutionary and as a Jew, for whom, as Franco so vividly captured, the revolution is not just social liberation, but also national liberation. And the question of anti-Semitism is felt differently for Friedland and others, then it's the pogroms in Chernigov that are the order of the day. So this is where, I guess, Jewish revolutionary, Marxist-Zionist, Bundist meets, revolutionary government, which is hanging on by a thread. And Lenin does nothing about it for 3 months. He's silent on the issue. That doesn't mean he's an anti-Semite. It means he's not dealing with it. He's not able to deal with it. He's not choosing to deal with it for 3 months. And it's in that period of inactivity that the Jewish Commissariat take matters into their own hand. And they're writing continually to the leadership saying, do something. They don't want to deal with this. If you look at the founding document of the Jewish Commissariat from January 1918, nowhere does it mention in its 20-point program that it will deal with anti-Semitism. That's not what it's set up to do. It's set up to Bolshevize Jewish workers, to translate the revolution into Yiddish, and to carry out a struggle against Zionism. That's what the Jewish Commissariat is set up to do. It ends up fighting anti-Semitism constantly in its earliest period.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry. So I hope that, Ellen, goes some way to asking about such a huge and great question you asked. Maybe we can talk about afterwards.
Thank you. So I've just got one very last quick question, and I think then we'll be having to wrap up. Layla, where's it gone? She's asking, during your research, did you find testimony from any perpetrators, including any photos or documents?
Layla, there's an amazing archive in the Russian State Archive, the State Archives of the Russian Federation. GARF it's called. So when you go in, there's this huge big fancy reading room, and it's relatively well kitted out, and it's a bit of a pain to get in, but once you're in, it's all fine. It's not the kind of stereotype of you can't get the files. It's very straightforward to get most of these documents. But I was trying to find testimonies exactly as you say. So they ended up sending me to this tiny little room on the other huge big complex, massive building. It's literally a small room, and the files are just stacked up on this table. And there's a young guy, and we had this small little table. He sat on one end, I sat on the other end. We sat there for like 3 weeks just meeting him at this table. He has to watch what you do because the files are so delicate. There was this organization called the Yevobshestkom, the Jewish Social Relief Committee, set up by the Bolsheviks actually, although it existed before the revolution and the Bolsheviks kind of took it over. And this organization collected testimonies from survivors, huge amounts of material from all different social classes, from rabbis, from local community members who lived through just the most unbelievably traumatic events. Most of it's in Yiddish. Quite a good number of it is, a good section of the materials are in Russian. Some of this has been published in a Russian language book called Kniga Pogromov, the Book of the Pogroms. I have it on PDF. If anyone reads Russian, I'll be glad to send it to you by PDF. Some of the testimonies are included in that published collection. But these are, I'm just trying to, I guess I'm describing the archive just so you get a kind of a sense of just these bits of paper. When you touch them, the corners of the pages crumble. It's moving and delicate, and yeah, very powerful experience just to sit there in this tiny little room with a guy staring at you for 3 weeks reading this material. I'd be glad to share some of it with you.
Okay. Thank you very much. We do need to wrap up there. I'd like to thank our speaker, Brendan McGeever, for generously contributing his time. I'm really glad that he was able to join us, and for such a really illuminating talk about such a difficult subject. And I'd also like to say a huge thank you to everyone attending. I have put a link for an online survey. It only takes a couple of minutes. It's in the chats now. It will also be in the email that we'll send out with the recording. If anyone is able to take even just a couple of minutes, that would be absolutely incredible. We want to know what we're doing right, and we want to know what we can improve. We also have other talks and the next one is a week on Tuesday, the 10th of November. It's one of our Survivor Talk series, and Dr. Martin Kappel, who's himself a refugee, will be in conversation with renowned solicitor and legal campaigner Nazir Afzal. So we're really looking forward to that, and we hope that some of you will be able to join us again for that. So I'm just going, oh no, that's gone there. Again, thank you very much for attending. If you did enjoy this talk, please do look at our other online events, all of which we're offering free of charge. We receive no core funding as an organisation, so if you are able to give even just £1, every penny is hugely gratefully received, and it goes directly back into our work. I'm just going to put the link for that to our connects to our Just Giving page in the chat as well. And we really appreciate, like I say, everything that anyone is able to give. We're on various social media platforms, and as mentioned, please do follow us, and you can keep up to date with our newsletters. I do need to end on a tribute, really. I will just hand over to Brendan for a very short moment. Thank you. Brendan?
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all. I mean, to thank you, Alex, for asking me, and Alessandro for asking me to be here, and to all of you for not only coming but for like sharing your lives in this chat function with me. It's really moving to, you know, you spend so much time thinking about this subject in a kind of academic way, and then it suddenly and very quickly becomes really human and as well as academic. And I'm really grateful for all of you for the questions and for the sharing. And just to say, if anyone did want to sort of read the book, it's finally now out in paperback. It was like £75 the last year. It's been out it's hardback only. It's just come out in paperback, and there is a discount code. I mean, this is grotesque. What do you call it? It's not, I don't know, self-promotion or something like that. But I'll give you the code just in case there is like one person in the room that wants to know what it is. I'm just going to share it just now. Yeah. Can you see that on the screen? It's HIS 3920, HIS 3920. If you go onto the Cambridge University Press website and type that in somewhere, I think they'll reduce it from like £22 to £19 or something like that. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I think we'll be getting ourselves a copy. I'm just putting that code in the chat as well. I do need to end on a sad note this evening, because it wouldn't be right to not mention this. The centre exists, as I mentioned, because of a group of people coming together to provide a legacy. And we do need to acknowledge the tireless work of one person to bring the centre and a lasting legacy of our survivors into being, Lillian Black. She's the daughter of camp survivor Eugene Black, whose story we tell in the exhibition. She worked and campaigned hard to help tell his and others' story, and help us to be able to continue with that work in the future in events like this, highlighting the need for this educational work that Brendan is a member of as well. I'm very sorry to share the news that Lillian passed away in hospital this afternoon. And I know that you will all join us in sending all care to her husband, Frank, her family, and join us in expressing our sorrow at their loss. And the centre is also her legacy. And we'll work even harder to make sure that is carried forward. So I'm sorry to end on a sad note, but we felt it wouldn't be right not to pay tribute to her. So I hope you will all join me in thanking Brendan for joining us, and hopefully you will all be able to join us at future events to honour all those involved in helping the centre come to fruition and for our work to continue, including Lillian. Thank you very much. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your evening. Thank you.